Hello and welcome to Books at HSS, a podcast by the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences at LUMS. For this podcast, we invite faculty at the department to talk about their books. And today we have with us Dr. Waqar Zaidi, who is Associate Professor of History at HSS, and he will be talking with us about his book, Technological Internationalism and World Order, Aviation, Atomic Energy, and the Search for International Peace between 1920 and 1950. The book has won the 2022 International Committee for the History of Technology Turriano Prize. Thank you for being with us today, Waqar.
Thank you, Nauman.
Okay, so before we get into the book, could you tell us a little bit about yourself, your journey leading up to this project, and how this project came into being?
So this project is based on loosely based on my doctoral research. I completed my PhD work at the Center for the History of Science, Technology and Medicine at Imperial College back in 2009. And then it took me, 10 odd years to gather up extra work, extra research, and to really mold this project from a PhD project into a distinct monograph. So this book has its origins in my long-standing interest in the impact of technology on international relations, firstly, and secondly, the role of ideology and our beliefs and visions in the way we understand technology and its impact on the world. So I see this book very much as an intervention in and a manifestation of my wider, if you like, intellectual concerns with these types of issues.
Okay, great. So, as our first question, could you give our auditors and viewers a broad sense of the major claims you stake in the monograph, a summary of sorts?
So the book is an exploration of proposals, visions, plans for the institution of collective security through the League of Nations and the United Nations. And in particular, I focus on schemes and ideas that centered around the use of the modern technologies of aviation and atomic energy. So what I do really is to turn my gaze onto attempts to create world order, international security, and attempts to strengthen these international organizations using, in the first instance, aviation, particularly heavy bombers, from the 1920s onwards to 1945, and secondly, atomic weapons and atomic energy more broadly from 1945 to around 1950. What I do is I focus on liberal internationalists, which have been studied in the existing literature. But I argue that these are internationalists, visionaries who are particularly taken and enthusiastic about technology. And so I call them technological internationalists. Between 1920 and 1945, their proposals focus on the use of the heavy bomber. And what they attempt to do is firstly to regulate bombing and aviation in the international sphere. The airplane, they argue, is too dangerous to be left unfettered or left to nation states, particularly, they argue, within the current chaotic and anarchic state of international relations. Instead, they argue the airplane needed to be controlled by and organized by an international organization that represented the community of nations, which in the 1920s and 30s meant the League of Nations. So their proposals in the 20s and 30s were that aviation be regulated, controlled, as was the term then used, by the League of Nations, and that nation states would not be allowed to own heavy bombers at all, and in some of their proposals, even fighters. In some proposals, they argued that nation states would not be able to own their own airlines. So the airlines of the world were to be internationalized. That is, abolished, national airlines were to be abolished, and instead they were to be controlled by the League of Nations. So imagine one large League of Nations airline. The idea was that aviation in total needed to be organized rationally on an international scale, and that if airlines were left to nation states, then they would misuse them. In other words, they would convert airlines into bombers, which was a very real fear by the early 1930s. So these proposals really, in terms of aviation, reached their peak around the 1932 Geneva Disarmament Conference, and then died away into the late 30s as international relations in Europe worsened with the rise of fascism and Nazi Germany. And of course the war then started in 1939, the Second World War. However, the proposals didn't die away completely. Instead, they were reborn during the war in both Britain and the United States, where internationalists then started to look towards the end of the war. And they resurrected these proposals as a part of a broader turn towards post-war planning. The war would end, argued these internationalists in Britain and America, and once the war ended, the Allied powers needed to ensure that the war wouldn't occur again. And so they resurrected aviation as a tool for international peace for the end of the war. Now, by 1944, of course, the League of Nations had died. And so for these internationalists, the new carrier of their technological hopes and visions was to be this new organization that was planned in 1944, which was the United Nations Organization. And so in these proposals reborn during the war, it was the United Nations that was to arm itself with heavy bombers and fighters. And these visions may sound fantastical today. Indeed, they do sound fantastical today. That's because we don't really hear of these types of proposals anymore in relation to arms control, disarmament, or collective security. But for the time, they were very widely and seriously discussed in internationalist circles, amongst policymakers, in international diplomatic conferences. And indeed, the proposals for a United Nations Air Force made its way into discussions on the United Nations at Dumbarton Oaks, for example, in 1944, into the San Francisco Conference on the formation of the United Nations in 1945, and eventually into the articles, into the Charter of the United Nations itself. So it isn't very well known today, but if you were to look at the Charter of the United Nations, you would see that there is a provision for the creation of a United Nations Air Force, right? So what happens in 1945 then is that a new technology is unveiled to the world in August 1945, which is atomic energy and nuclear weapons. And these internationalists then begin to argue that actually post-August 1945, post the bombings at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the weapon that they and societies need to worry about is no longer the heavy bomber or the airplane, but now it's atomic weapons. And so their proposals shift from aviation to atomic energy and nuclear weapons. And internationalists begin to argue from August 1945 onwards that it's now atomic energy that needs to be controlled, that it's now atomic energy, and that's a phrase, incidentally, that's used at the time to mean both atomic power, nuclear power plants, and atomic bombs, that it's atomic energy that now needs to be controlled by international organization. And so the proposals you find from late 1945 onwards to about 1950 focus on atomic weapons and atomic power, and argue that the United Nations needs to take control of all atomic facilities. In some proposals, atomic bombs are to be abolished because they're too dangerous. And yet in other proposals, bizarrely enough, atomic weapons are to be given over to the United Nations, to be used against countries that dare to go against the dictates of the Security Council. Once again, these proposals now sound extreme. I mean, imagine a United Nations armed with nuclear weapons at the beck and call of the Security Council. And yet these proposals were widely discussed in the late 1940s. They were supported by well-known luminaries. In Britain, for example, Bertrand Russell, who once suggested that the United States preemptorily nuclear bomb the Soviet Union in 1945. And they were discussed at international conferences. And in fact, there was a diplomatic proposal, the so-called Acheson-Lilienthal Plan and the Baruch Plan, that was put forward by the United Nations, by the United States at the United Nations Atomic Energy Commission in 1946. And the proposal was for exactly this, the internationalization of atomic energy. So what my book does is really trace these proposals from their inception after the First World War all the way through to their demise around 1950. And what it argues is that they show a certain enthusiasm and a certain fascination with and for science and technology within liberal internationalism, amongst internationalists. And the book argues that there is, if you like, a singular or a number of ideological threads that run all the way through from the 1920s through to the 1950s. So this concern with the anarchy of international relations, this attempt to create a muscular international organization using technology. And you also find many other reoccurring ideas and conceptualizations that carry forward from the world of aviation and thinking about aviation and international relations in the 1930s through to the world of thinking about atomic energy from 1945 onwards.
Great. Thank you so much for that comprehensive summary. The next question I want to ask you about is a neologism that you've coined in the book, technological internationalism or technological internationalists, who are also, as we've just seen, the main protagonists of the narrative that you're constructing. So could you tell us about who they were and in what ways did they identify as internationalists? So what is technological internationalism?
So the term liberal internationalism is well used and long-standing in academic literature, and it refers to groups of policymakers, visionaries, international relations thinkers, writers, sometimes civil servants, sometimes politicians, who essentially want to create international law and order, a liberal world order that centers around a community of nations, that tries to create rationality, that tries to tackle the chaos and anarchy, as they see it, of international relations, and that attempts to bring order and rationality in international affairs in order to bring peace and security. And often the underlying worldview of these liberal internationalists is one of the need for international trade, international commerce, and the need for international peace in order to not only safeguard people's lives, but also to bring economic benefits through international trade, commerce, and unfettered, if you like, or relatively unregulated or relatively unrestricted international trade and commerce. So that's liberal internationalism. Now, what I argue is that there was a subset of these internationalists who were deeply enamored with, as I've just said, with technology, in aviation in particular in the 1920s and 30s. And so they fixated on and focused on aviation as, if you like, the solution to the problem of international peace. In some ways, their attempts to create a machinery of peace, as a phrase that was then used at the time, focused on technologies that they saw as machines of peace. So for them, airplanes were naturally, in fact, liberal technologies and liberalizing technologies because they brought people together. Naturally, they helped people travel. They inculcated international trade and commerce, right? These were all the values of a good liberal internationalist. And yet they saw them as being abused by militant nation states. So the idea was to help fulfill the ultimate potential of these technologies by taking them away from nation states and giving them to international organization. So I use the word technological internationalism to refer to a cluster of ideas and beliefs about technologies that centered around aviation in the 1920s and 30s, but then shift on to another technology in 1945, which is atomic energy, which consists of atomic power and atomic weapons. And what I do there is I make the argument that lots of individuals in Britain and the United States who are already well studied in the literature and are generally known as atomic scientists, and who called for the internationalization of atomic energy at the time in 1945, from late 1945 onwards, were in fact liberal internationalists, right? And they were a particular type of liberal internationalists. They were technological internationalists. And I do this in order to connect them with their ideological descendants, if you like, from the 1920s and 30s. So the sorts of people who called for aviation, the international control of aviation, were not necessarily the same as those who called for the international control of atomic energy. And yet I argue that they shared ideological connections. So, for example, the technological internationalists that I look at in the 1920s and 30s include individuals such as David Davies, Philip Noel Baker. In Britain and in the United States, Clyde Eagleton and James T. Shotwell. So these are all very well-known liberal internationalist figures. And yet, when you get to 1945 and 46, you find that there's a new group. Some of the old individuals continue, and they swap their rhetoric from aviation to atomic energy, but they're soon joined by a new set of internationalists. So this the literature has coined and has seen as atomic scientists. So they include luminaries such as Leo Szilard, J. Robert Oppenheimer, of course, a very well-known so-called father of the atomic bomb. So these, and others as well, peripherally, for example, Albert Einstein. So these are scientists who are calling for international control. Yet I argue that their arguments are not peculiar to science and don't really come out of their identity as scientists. In fact, they do in some ways, but I argue that they belong to a wider and longer tradition of thinking about technology and international relations in an internationalist way. And so I coined that term in order to put these different sets of individuals and these different sets of ideas together.
Thank you for that. So what I want us to draw our attention next to is this fascination with aviation, right? And you said that there, as a machinery of peace in the 20s, 30s, but also this ambivalence, right? That aviation is both these bombers are dangerous and they need to be regulated at an international level. So how do they square how do they imagine aviation as both a machinery of peace, but also something dangerous and cataclysmic? So what's going on there with these technological internationalists and aviation, if you could shed some light on that?
Yes, Nauman. I mean, that really gets to the heart of some of the beliefs that these individuals hold about the nature of not only aviation, but broadly of science and technology. It is a fairly well-known trope now to academics that people have tended to regard, not all people, but there has been a tendency to regard science and technology as dual-faced. So this is something that goes, found expression most famously and most early on, I suppose, in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, this idea that science brings benefits but can be misused and abused. And that understanding is taken up by these thinkers on international relations and projected into international affairs and their thinking on international affairs, and is then materialized in the guise of aviation. So if you were to read any of the major texts on international relations in the late 1920s and early 1930s, and indeed if you were studying international relations at a leading university in Britain or the United States at that time, you would read a textbook that would tell you in a chapter on science and technology. This could be a textbook written, for example, by the great historian and international relations specialist James T. Shotwell, or by Clark Eichelberger, and the book will tell you that science and technology is dual-faced, that it brings great power and possibility to the human race, but that it can be misused. And in a certain analytical frame, the textbook will explain to you, and this would be an internationalist textbook, because indeed they were all internationalist textbooks, these books on international relations in that time period. It would tell you that and explain that these technologies are misused by the forces of militarism, right, and the forces of nationalism. Not patriotism. Patriotism is a good thing, but militarism and nationalism is patriotism taken too far. And that one way that it's taken too far is that it tends to use otherwise benevolent and positive technologies in a negative way. And the archetypal example that they focus on, but they often give other examples as well. They talk about radio, they talk about wireless, they talk about steamships. But the big example for the day was aviation. And they argue that on the one hand you have the ability to cross oceans, the ability to move people, the ability to trade, to carry out commerce, to bring nations and peoples together through understanding, travel, tourism, mass transport. So that's the potential, and yet nation states are building fleets of heavy bombers. They are taking their aeronautical scientists and putting them to use to build fighters, to make plans to bomb other nations. And what these thinkers are picking up on, and the reason they focus on aviation, is because there is a widespread fear and fascination with aviation in the 1920s and 30s. So these internationalists latch on to something which is society-wide at the time. Aviation is seen as the most modern of modern technologies, as an exemplar of what humanity can do if it works, if it uses its science and its inventiveness. And it's a source of fascination and spectacle for the middle-class European and the middle-class American, and in fact not just the middle class, but indeed all classes. So there are air shows, record-breaking crossings across the Atlantic, or from country to country, are front-page news in the daily newspapers. There is an air show that brings in over a million visitors in Britain. There are air races which sometimes have awards and trophies that can go into hundreds of thousands of dollars. So there is a society that's fascinated with aviation, and this fascination has turns to horror by the late 20s and 30s, when the fear starts to grow that the next war, and I think by the late 20s there is a sense that there might be another war, that the next war would be a war fought in the air. And in the next war, heavy bombers would not only destroy soldiers and armies, but would destroy people, their communities, cities, and indeed whole countries, and in fact whole civilizations. And there's a very famous statement that's made in the Houses of Parliament by a British politician, Stanley Baldwin, in the early 1930s, who says that the bomber will always get through, right? That there's no defense against the bomber. It's the ultimate weapon, and God save us all if there is a bombing war. And that statement is made against a backdrop of rearmament, where there is an arms race which is taking place between the great European powers, an arms race that has moved on from the battleships of the 1910s and 1920s to the heavy bombers of the 1930s. And indeed, it seems like by the late 30s that these fears are well-founded. We have the rise of fascism, we have the rise of Hitler, who is rearming at an alarming rate. And then, of course, you have the Spanish Civil War, where for the first time European states are horrified to see the utter decimation and destruction of Spanish cities by German bombers, right? So the Nazi Germany helps Franco and his military force with bombers, and it seems to portend the future of war. And in fact, science fiction writers at the time stand up and say, "We told you so." So H.G. Wells has written about the future of warfare, and for him, since at least 1900, and for him the future of warfare was to be aerial, right? And by the early 1930s, he's telling anyone who would listen that, look, I told you that the next war will be a war in the air in which societies will be destroyed. And indeed, he writes a best-selling a future history of the world in the early 30s, in which humanity is decimated by warfare and then has to take many, many, in fact, centuries to rebuild itself and to rebuild civilization. And in this book, it's bombers that destroy first the European states and then everyone else, because like H.G. Wells, like others, is expecting a global war. But what's interesting, of course, is that in this book, it's aviation that helps to reconstruct and re-knit mankind into one global human social fabric. So it's airplanes and aviators who kind of bring people together, right, in this future history. So there is a great fascination with aviation. And for anyone...
And that ambivalence, again, of aviation as the source of destruction and the possible source of bringing us together.
Absolutely, absolutely. So there's a fear that that bombers can destroy, but then there's also a sort of an underlying fascination and appreciation that aviation is good for humanity and that represents what's best in humanity and the future of humanity in terms of its modernity. This is sometimes this ambivalence and this fascination manifests in the writings that I look at, in the ideologues and their thinking on international affairs that I look at through the concept of convertibility, which is this idea not only that you can take a civilian aircraft industry and then suddenly use it for military ends. So imagine a government telling a civilian aircraft manufacturer to stop making airliners and to start making bombers, right? Which is indeed what happens in the Second World War. But it also means that there's a fear that individual airliners could be fitted with bomb racks and then used for bombing. And that's one of the reasons why these proposals call for complete internationalization. A lot of them call for complete internationalization of all aviation. And this ambivalence then carries through from aviation into atomic energy, of course.
Which is the next question I want to talk to you about. So in the mid-40s, this fascination with aviation transforms into fascination with atomic energy and nuclear energy. Could you speak to that?
Absolutely. So for anyone who studied the 1940s, it's very clear that the atomic bomb, once it's dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, is a worldwide event. Everyone's talking about it, everyone's worried about it, and everyone is foreseeing a new future of the world in which if there's another war, then the war now won't be a war of heavy bombers, or rather, it will be a war of heavy bombers, but the bombers will no longer be armed with incendiary and explosive bombs, but they'll be armed with atomic bombs. So the next war would be an atomic war. So what you see is that a lot of the fears about heavy bombing from the 30s are taken up and then transposed onto atomic energy. So there's a fear that it'll be atomic bombs now that will decimate societies, and indeed the term used is civilization, decimate civilization, and that now it's atomic energy which has a dual character. In other words,
this too has ambivalence built into it.
Absolutely. So atomic energy is very early on touted by atomic scientists as a great new force that has a potential to provide almost limitless, and that's a phrase that's often used in the American press and the British press at the time, almost limitless power, and yet which is being abused by militaristic governments for military ends. So leading scientists, physicists, chemists, even scientists who had worked on the Manhattan Project turn around and say that we should be putting research and development into power plants so that we can have, cheap energy that is electricity that's too cheap to meter. That's a phrase that's often used, right? The era of coal is ended, it's said, read headlines. We're now in the era of atomic energy. And so the argument made by these atomic scientists, by these technological internationalists, is that we need to take atomic energy away from nation states, because all they're going to do with it is build lots of atomic bombs and perhaps destroy us and everyone else. Instead, we need to safeguard atomic energy to make sure that it's used for peaceful purposes. And so you have these astonishing proposals that are discussed in the United Nations for the creation of United Nations power plants, for the creation of internationalized United Nations territories, such as the one that bizarrely enough exists in Manhattan at the moment around the United Nations headquarters, that now would encompass uranium mines in the middle of the United States, that would encompass nuclear power plants in Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union. You would have blue-helmeted United Nations soldiers guarding power plants that would be owned and run by United Nations scientists. And the idea is that they would ensure that it's only used for good rather than for evil.
Wow. Fascinating. So my next question is you've built continuities between how aviation and atomic energy both become sort of means through which an international order is being proposed, and the dangers of these technologies if left to warring nation states, what those dangers might look like. So this juxtaposition in the book, what's the broader historiographical point that you're trying to make by putting both these technologies and technological internationalism in relation to both these forms of technologies in the same monograph? Could you speak to us about that?
Yeah, so that I think is one of the sort of distinctive turns that my book takes, that there is an existing literature. In fact, there is a vast literature on the history of aviation and a vast literature on the early history of atomic energy. And yet there are no histories that put these two together in the same frame. And I think one of those reasons is that historians have tended to peculiarize these technologies as peculiar not only in their time, but they tend to see them as a product of their own time and tend to see discourses around them as a product of these technologies themselves. So let me put that in another way. In other words, if someone is thinking about the great benefits of aviation, then their ideas are driven by aviation itself and its impact on international affairs. Similarly, the literature tells us that those who are thinking about the great benefits of atomic energy, for example, the group of scientists that the literature calls atomic scientists, then they are being driven by the peculiarities of atomic energy itself. In fact, there is a large literature that tells us that the atomic scientists movement is born of atomic energy and that its ideas are a product of the new atomic age. So by putting aviation and atomic energy in the same frame, I think what I'm trying to say is that, well, actually there are pre-existing ideas that pre-exist atomic energy that have an impact on the way people think about atomic energy, right? So in other words, thinking about atomic energy is not peculiar to atomic energy itself. It comes from deeper, longer-standing concerns about technology and international affairs. One of the historiographical significances of this is that then allows you to construct these longer ideological narratives that break through the 1945 barrier. So for a lot of historians, the end of the Second World War is indeed a very important either starting point or ending point in their narratives and their analyses. And what my book does is kind of attempt to break through this barrier and say that, well, actually there are these strong continuities into at least the early post-war period. And I think the broader point being made by putting them together and coining the term technological internationalism is I am pointing to this fascination with technology in international relations and in amongst thinkers on international relations. I think there is a tendency to see a lot of this writing on science and technology as fearful of weapons and armaments, as anti-military and anti-militarist. And one of the big points my book makes by putting both aviation and atomic energy together is that actually these people are not pacifists, right? They're internationalists, but they're not pacifists. And indeed, they have opponents who are pacifists. So what they actually want is to use weapons, if necessary, for international order. They want international peace and security, right? So a lot of atomic scientists don't want to see atomic weapons abused by nation states. They don't want wars between nation states. But that doesn't mean that they don't want to see atomic bombs or bombers used by United Nations or the League of Nations to instill international law and order that's backed by the community of nations. In other words, these internationalists are supporting a liberal internationalist world order built around and centered on these organizations. And of course, within these organizations, one knows that there are various great powers that really hold sway. And so what this internationalism is doing is cementing the power of these great powers, which in the 1930s were Britain and France, and by the 1940s was the United States, right? Primarily and secondarily Britain. What's particularly interesting about all of this is that a lot of their visions for the use of military technologies by international organization, they see not as war making. So for them, wars are made by the Soviet Union and the United States. Wars are not made by the United Nations. The United Nations, when it bombs nation states that defy the Security Council, is carrying out policing action. So one of the important moves that's made in this internationalist thinking, really from the 1920s and even earlier, in fact, onwards, is to call international action by legal international organizations, not as war making, but as international policing action. And in doing this, a lot of these proposals, knowingly and often unknowingly, are actually basing their ideas about bombing on colonial bombing. So colonial bombing, there's a rich history of colonial bombing, a rich and very sordid history of the use of bombers in the colonies by the Italians, the French, but especially the British in the 1920s and the 1930s. And these internationalists, in fact, are taking the lessons of imperial and colonial bombing and are looking to apply them to Europe and indeed the whole world. And what lesson is this? The lesson is that bombing, when held by a superior civilizing force, a legal civilizing force, has the capability of suppressing chaos, barbarism, anarchy. And in the case of Britain, for example, the so-called anarchy in Waziristan, and for the Italians, the so-called anarchy in Libya.
Yeah. You mentioned their opponents right now. So who are the folks who are opposing technological internationalists, and what's their take on technology, or in fact these broader legal organizations? Are there ambivalences at play over there? What does that look like?
Yes, absolutely. There is a lot of opposition, which I explore throughout the book. These visions and these plans, these ideas, these diplomatic proposals don't come to fruition. There are a number of reasons for that. Some are systemic and to do with growing great power rivalry between Germany on the one side and Britain and France, for example, on the other in the early 1930s, and of course in 1946 between the Soviet Union and the United States. But there is another reason, which is that they're opposed within Britain and the United States itself. And they're opposed by various constituencies. Perhaps the most powerful of these constituencies are individuals who you might crudely call realists. So these are people who believe that power should reside in nation states. They believe that their country sits in a world of conflict with other nation states, and that it would be foolish for any country to give up whatever weapons it feels it might need to defend itself. So for them, any form of disarmament, or rather I would say most forms of disarmament, most forms of arms control, and certainly collective security are a pipe dream, right? Instead, what they would like is to see more national armaments. So in Britain, you would have politicians and policymakers who are typically on the center-right of the political spectrum. For example, the Conservative Party. You would see most policymakers, civil servants would fall into this category. But you would also see groups who I generally put together as the aviation lobby. So this would be the aviation ministry, this would be the Royal Air Force, this would be the aircraft manufacturers. And for them it's preposterous. These schemes are preposterous. For them it's ridiculous that aviation should be given up. They want strengthened national aviation. They want more bombers and airplanes for the RAF. They want more airlines. They want more national flying. They want bigger national airports. For them the idea of a League of Nations Air Force is dangerous because it threatens not only their industries and their factories, but the national security of their country itself. And they consider themselves patriot, British or Frenchmen, or in the case of the United States, Americans. So that's one set of very powerful opponents who manage to check a lot of these proposals at every turn. The others are pacifists who are equally horrified that internationalist organizations, of which often they are a part, so internationalist pressure groups such as the League of Nations Union, which is created in Britain in order to foster greater communication, greater brotherhood between nations, greater fraternity between nations, greater movement of people. Pacifists are part of these organizations, but they're shocked that there are others in these organizations who would turn around and say, yes, we think wars are terrible, and so to stop wars, we would give the League of Nations a massive bombing fleet that could be sent anywhere around the world to teach aggressive nations a lesson, right? In the way that the British have done to the warring, so-called, supposedly warring and restless tribes. So I'm using these sort of Orientalist tropes, restless tribes of Waziristan. So for pacifists, this is shocking. And so pacifist groups oppose these proposals vehemently.
Thank you. So right at the conclusion of the book, you talk about how the concerns of technological internationalism and internationalists morph in the 50s and 60s. They don't disappear, but what does that morphing look like? How do they inflect future conversations, even if they don't exist as coherent groups? Or do they continue to exist in what way do they continue to exist as coherent groups? If you could talk to us about that.
Right. There are all sorts of proposals in 1946 and 1947 in the United Nations for the creation of some sort of United Nations atomic capability with atomic power plants, regulation. But for these sorts of proposals to work, you need some level of agreement between the two great superpowers, the emergent superpowers, the Soviet Union and the United States. This agreement doesn't happen because the Cold War deepens. And in fact, instead of the two great powers coming together, there's growing animosity. You have the Berlin airlift, and you have the problems. You have the fall. You have the falling down of an iron curtain, if you like, across Europe, and you have the growing Cold War. So these proposals fall apart, and instead, internationalists find that their proposals increasingly have less respectability. So by 1950, it's a new era in which there may still be internationalists, but no one can really call for disarmament or arms control in Britain or the United States. In fact, this is a time of massive rearmament and the building up of bomber fleets, armies, and nuclear weapons stockpiles. So in this time period, the space for liberal internationalism, cosmopolitanism as well, shrinks rapidly. And internationalism itself goes into decline. Nevertheless, it doesn't quite die. There are resurgencies, and some of these ideas do reappear in various venues. For example, the pugwash movement in 1957 and 1958 and onwards. Some ideas disappear from the realm of policymaking and diplomacy, but because they were so widely discussed in the 1940s, they remain in the realm of fiction. So you start to see that science fiction writers from the late 40s, the biggest example being Robert A. Heinlein, pick up these proposals and they project them into outer space. So probably the most famous, Robert A. Heinlein, of course, very well known, but it's also there in comics, Marvel comics. Think of the Avengers and these huge machines that they have in these Avenger movies, to bring collective security from above, the super carriers. I'm not sure what they're called in today's movies. But the other very big example where these ideas live on is through an individual who was a bomber pilot, a U.S. Air Force pilot during the Second World War. He went on to fly for Pan Am in the late 40s, and he loved these ideas, and so he picked them up and he projected them into outer space in a screenplay that he wrote in the 1960s. And that, of course, is Gene Roddenberry, who writes Star Trek. And Star Trek is based on technological internationalism. It's this idea that a particular technology, which in his case is the hyperdrive, star drive, allows for the knitting together of these far-flung polities, which are not nation-states now, but they are these various alien races, into a federation, which is policed, right? So what's interesting about the federation is that, rather like the internationalist visions of the 30s and 40s, you have an international political organization with a general Security Council based in San Francisco in the case of Star Trek, but it has its own air force, which is the Starfleet, and a Starfleet that uses science and technology not only negatively but also positively. So it has spaceships whose primary role is to explore rather than to fight, and the most famous, of course, is the USS Enterprise, right? So these ideas continue into science fiction, and as I mentioned with Avengers comics, they're still with us today, but they die in the diplomatic sphere, and that's, I think, one of the reasons why they have this fantastical, if you like, aura to them today. It's very much something that you'd read in science fiction, but you wouldn't expect to read about on the front pages of a newspaper.
Thank you so much, Waqar. And for our last question, what's next for you? What are you working on? Are you building on this project? Are you going in another direction?
Yes, I'm taking a slightly a turn sideways. I'm writing a book on the globalization of aviation in the early Cold War period. So chronologically, I'm picking up after 1950. I'll be looking at the 1950s and 60s. And my new book is exploring the role of the Cold War in the globalization of civil aviation in Asia. So one of the key arguments that I'll be making is that we have a tendency to think that civil aviation in the 20th century is a product of globalization and is driven by technological changes and the growing middle classes, whereas I want to locate it very much in the geopolitics of the Middle East and the Near East, as it was then understood, and in the politics of the Cold War in the 1950s.
Perfect. Thank you so much for being with us today.